Hi, I'm GerrySmith, and as you can see, this presentation is going to be on reductive forms. This is the structure of my talk. I'll try and keep to it. Right. In 1961, Francois Lyonnais proposed the creation and exploration of reductive poetic forms, including poems constructed from punctuation. The early 1960s also saw Ian Hamilton Finlay's one-word poems, whilst Yoko Ono experimented with compositions which used a format of simple instructions. These are the reference points for my punctuation poetry, which emerged out of an ongoing process of formal experimentation. Such experiments play a generative role in the research process of my intermediate text-based art practice. I'll outline the development of my poetry relating it to the artists mentioned, and I'll show how my initial experiments responded to challenges presented by Lyonnais' work. Also, I'll talk about how a variation on Ono's instruction format enabled me to pursue a form of endotics. Endotics being George Peric's term for the critical study of the infraordinary or the everyday, the quotidian. Further experiments with punctuation poetry resulted in the Some Lines series, which I'll talk about. These poems referenced Ono's Fluxus period works. Through the use of a mundane literalism, these poems deliberately challenged viewers' readers' expectations by simply depicting the poem's titles. Many viewers found them incomprehensible. As items of exchange, the poem's political impact arises from their refusal of commodification. They present the obvious in an unobvious way and are intended to make the viewer question what they're looking at. Lyonnais stated that scholars will one day assemble an international anthology of poems of few words. It is perfectly natural for the Oulipo to study the invention, legitimacy and effectiveness of less than 5-worders. More generally, examining the validity of poems comprising of no words to an infinite number of them is a task worth undertaking and pursuing scientifically. Now, Lyonnais was a Dadaist poet and founder member of the Oulipo, the Workshop for Potential Literature. The Oulipo is a research group of writers and mathematicians that explore the use of writing structures. Harry Matthews notes the group's insistence on the distinction between created creations and creations that create. Favouring the latter, the workshop's concern is, quote, not with literary works, but procedures and structures capable of producing them. In Lyonnais' exercises of potential literature in 1961, he put forward 3 reductive forms: one-word poems, single-letter poems, and poems constructed from punctuation. He offered the following examples. These attempts at going for the limit were typical of the Oulipo's experiments. Although Lyonnais believed that the single-letter poetry may lie on the far side of the acceptable limit. When he completed the poem Tea, he said it was up to his colleagues to complete the set of 26 Roman letters. I'll come back to this later on. Ian Hamilton Finlay was also working on his one-word poems. These achieved their poetic effect through the relationship established between the word and the title, as this example called The Cloud's Anchor. At that time, Yoko Ono was producing compositions that consisted of a short instruction or series of instructions. For example, a shadow piece which simply said, put your shadows together until they become one. She also produced a number of gallery works which continued to use such cone-like statements. For example, this line is part of a large sphere, a straight line exists only in your mind, or the sphere will be a sharp point when it gets to the far side of the room in your mind. My final point of reference is the endotics of George Peric, author and Oulipo member. In 1973, in Approaches to What, he proposed endotics as the critical study of the infraordinary, saying, what's needed perhaps is finally to found our own anthropology, one that will speak about us. We'll look in ourselves for what for so long we've been pillaging from others. Not the exotic anymore, but the endotic. Perrick deemed the everyday worthy of attention precisely because it is generally seen as irrelevant, as if it weren't the bearer of any information. He wanted to question what seems so much matter of course that we've forgotten its origins. Perrick's endotic writings form the basis of my current work with participatory art forms. Now, in my practice, I use the printed words and I reference existing texts, often taking small fragments as scores to improvise upon. Most of these works are produced within self-imposed constraints. In 2008, I'd been working on short form pieces consisting of 1 or 2 paragraphs of prose, and that's when I came across Leonie's proposal. I was both taken by and annoyed at it. The minimalism of it appealed to me, but I didn't see the one-letter poem being as limited as he suggested. So, in response to his assumption of the complete set of 26 Roman letters, I produced 2 poems in response to Francois Leonie. Both letters here, the SZ and the York, are from Roman alphabets. And the York is the 27th letter of the Scots alphabet. Like T, both letters function perfectly well as one-letter poems. Furthermore, establishing a relationship between them allowed me to expand the meaning of the artwork. This piece, Guillemots, I also produced at the time, and it includes a punctuation haiku. I reasoned that if poems can be constructed from punctuation marks, then existing poetic structures could be used to shape them. The main obstacle was deciding on the syllable content, how it was to be determined. Thereafter, it was fairly straightforward. The result was part ideogram and part pun, but it can be read as any traditional haiku. The first instruction pieces in 2009 were based upon a format used by Yoko Ono. However, I dispensed with Ono's cone-like utterances, opting for a more mundane descriptive approach, which I would later refer to as mundane literalism. Here I was influenced by Perrick's endotics. I wanted to look at everyday objects and how we used them. For these works, I employed a simple transposition in that I took contemporary technologies and imposed upon them the conventions of use associated with earlier equivalents. How to put on some music takes the music download and treats it as if it were a vinyl 45. The instruction pieces and the reductive poems developed alongside one another, and a feedback loop was soon established between them. Now, both Guillemots and 2 poems in response were experiments. I had no intention of pursuing work on reductive poetic forms. However, in 2009, I was working with material that brought me to look at paradoxes and singularities, infinities collapsing into themselves. One result was 2 punctuation poems. Both of these poems were concerned with endless lines, and both were physically the same, a 16-point full stop. In both, the title simply described the poem's content, whilst the content derived its meaning from the title. In composing this work, it occurred to me that I could expand the potential meaning of a punctuation mark by simply giving it a different title. Here, Finlay's one-word poems was the model. Furthermore, I decided to pursue the notion of a mundane literalism in a series of poems in which the titles would simply describe the poem's content. The Some Lines series referenced Fluxus period Yoko Ono. This line is part of a large sphere. A straight line exists only in your mind. The 2 largest pieces here, each line just short of 183 centimetres, play upon feet as units of poetic metre and spatial measurement. An Alexandrine and this line is 6 feet long, are both Alexandrines. When displayed alongside one another, they reinforce the other's meanings. These are poetic lines, 6 feet in length, and therefore they are Alexandrines. The second poem entitled "This Line is 6 feet long" appears more problematic, for its length is 3 feet, imperial measurement. However, this broken line is made up of the symbols for 12 stressed syllables, 6 spondees or 6 metrical feet in length. In this way too, it is an Alexandrine. I've continued to develop this poetry, and a recent showing of An Evening in Front of the Box brought punctuation, poem and instruction piece together for the first time. And Noise, included in the ELMSIP Anthology of Electronic Literature, is an animated concrete poem composed of binary code. I don't have time to show it here, so if you're interested, you can check this up online. In the introduction, I mentioned that some viewers found these works incomprehensible. The second version of this line is 6 feet long, and the Alexandrines that followed require some knowledge of poetic structures, although this information is provided in gallery literature when it is shown. This line is 6 feet long, and an Alexandrine are exhibited side by side and do not require a great conceptual leap, but simply the application of deductive reasoning. These works are deceptively simple. Indeed, they could be said to be shallow, since the information is out there in the open, nothing is hidden away, and the texts tend to reinforce the meanings of one another. All that is required is a bit of effort on the part of the viewer. Perhaps we should ask, what is the role of the audience in an artwork? Gallery goers will often spend more time travelling to an exhibition than they will standing in front of the artworks. People do not really look at artworks. They may glance over them, perhaps mentally tick them off their list, but they don't actually look at them very often. I know this both as an artist and as someone who's worked as a gallery attendant for many years. A basic requirement in the consumption of text-based art is that a certain amount of time is given over to the artwork by its audience, at least enough time for the viewer to read the given text. It forces a choice upon the audience: engage with the artwork or ignore it and move on. Whatever the response, at least they've made a decision. At the most basic level, text works refuse passive consumption. All that is required is a bit of effort on the part of the viewer. The difficulty of the punctuation poems was intended. They seek an exchange between artist and audience whilst refusing commodification. They resist interpretation. One reason for this is that these works address the question of what is the role of the audience in an artwork. There is an assumption that an artwork should give itself up to immediate understanding or easy interpretation. Would a reader be happy with a novel that laid out its entire contents so that you could quickly see what happened where and when, who did what and why, neatly arranged so that you didn't have to think about it? Why should this be expected of an artwork? It might be more rewarding for the audience if they had to work at it a bit. This works the other way around too, as the artist should assume that the viewer is at least as intelligent as they are. There should be no dumbing down. Resistance to interpretation is a counter to the passive consumption of artworks. Now, my use of a mundane literalism was also an endotic strategy. In the instruction pieces, it was intended to show how technologies shape us and are shaped by us. In some lines, the literalism was intended to obfuscate, to establish an astrani, a making strange of the artwork that stands before the viewer. The literalism of these poems can be just as confusing as Ono's cone-like utterances. It is a provocation, a challenge to the audience. This piece is lost in translation, and it's a more recent use of this technique. Its text is an inversion of the question and punchline of a joke. The original joke is, what comes between fear and sex? Funf is the answer. The title refers to the non-transparency of language. The joke is lost in translation. It also indicates that the text has been translated and thus offers us a potential strategy for recovering the joke's meaning. Undo the translation. Like the punctuation poems before it, this piece is deliberately confusing, but it does offer something at the end of it. Like the punctuation poems, it challenges the viewer to think about what stands before them. Both the instruction pieces and the reductive poems have had a generative role in my research process. This paper shows how a cross-fertilisation between these projects gave rise to developments in both form and content. These works enabled me to try out ideas which I'm now using in my investigations into the potential use of participatory artworks within endotic research. In that research, a major question is how can artworks draw attention to everyday situations that are so habitual that we take them for granted? These works not only allowed me to develop an endotics-based approach, but also to experiment with Ostrani. Within an endotics-based art practice, one possible strategy for drawing our attention to the quotidian is to make strange and everyday we think we already know. From here, we can start to question it anew. Thank you.